Live from London, this is BBC News. Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are expected to meet for a summit in the next few days to discuss a possible ceasefire in Ukraine. Jonathan Beale is our defence correspondent. He's live for us in Ukraine. We'll also hear from our Russia editor and our Washington correspondent. Israel's Security Cabinet is about to meet as Benjamin Netanyahu pushes for a full-scale occupation of the Gaza Strip. The Bank of England cuts the cost of borrowing to 4% despite predictions of a sharp rise in inflation. And the UK government unveils plans to crack down on risky cosmetic procedures like Botox injections carried out by unqualified staff. Hello and welcome to today's Verified Live. The Kremlin says there'll be a summit in the next few days between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin to discuss a possible ceasefire deal in Ukraine. It would be the first time the two men have held face-to-face talks for 7 years, and it comes after President Trump gave Russia an ultimatum to stop the fighting or face new economic sanctions from tomorrow. And in the last few minutes, the White House has said no date or location has yet been set for the meeting. Our security correspondent Frank Gardner has this report.
All smiles in Moscow as US presidential envoy Steve Witkoff held 3 hours of talks with Vladimir Putin. The aim? To steer Russia towards a ceasefire in Ukraine before new US sanctions are imposed on Friday. Mr. Witkoff is a frequent and welcome visitor to Russia. But the question is, will this lead to a repeat of this? The last Trump-Putin summit was 7 years ago, before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now that war is raging, and Russia is resisting calls for a full ceasefire. The two sides, Russia and Ukraine, both have demands unacceptable to the other. The exchange of POWs is the only thing achieved so far by peace talks. Meanwhile, the death toll continues to rise. India's economy is reeling this week from America's 50% trade tariffs, punishment for India buying Russia's oil. Donald Trump has hinted China could be next for these so-called secondary sanctions. Earlier, President Trump ordered 2 US Navy submarines to move closer to Russia as a warning, but the move was seen as largely performative. Both Putin and Trump want to normalize US-Russia relations, but Trump has signaled impatience with Putin's refusal to compromise. It's possible the two leaders will meet in Istanbul as early as next week. What's less likely is there will be any breakthrough in ending the war in Ukraine. Frank Gardner, BBC News.
Well, in just a moment, we'll speak live to our defence correspondent, Jonathan Beale, who's in Dnipro in Ukraine. But first, let's hear from our North America correspondent, Nomia Iqbal in Washington, and our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, in Moscow.
This is coming from Vladimir Putin's foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov, who spoke to Russian journalists earlier. He said the summit would take place in the next few days, possibly as early as next week, although that wasn't confirmed. He didn't confirm the location, but a short while ago, Vladimir Putin said that Russia had lots of friends in the world who could offer themselves as the venue, as the location. For example, he said the United Arab Emirates, but we'll have to wait for confirmation. Now, this follows yesterday's talks in the Kremlin between Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, and President Putin. At that meeting, Yuri Ushakov said, Mr. Witkoff raised the possibility of a three-way summit. Presidents Putin, Trump, and Zelensky. He said that Russia hadn't responded to that. But it's remarkable. We've gone from talking about American ultimatums and deadlines to now talking about let's have a summit.
Well, President Trump has become more cautious than optimistic. Last month, he told the BBC in an interview that he'd been left disappointed many times by President Putin. His peace envoy, Steve Witkoff, has been to the Kremlin several times, and the meetings have always ended productively and constructively. But of course, that big prize of a ceasefire or a peace deal has never been struck. And Mr. Trump cut the deadline to Friday. He wants a ceasefire, otherwise Russia will face sweeping sanctions. But President President Trump seems to be optimistic again. Having said that, he has been candid. Back in April, in response to a reporter, he did say that he wasn't quite sure if Putin was stringing him along. And I do think there is a sense here in the US, certainly politically, that Vladimir Putin is far more invested in waging this war than perhaps the Trump administration realized. And so it's really up to the president to work out just exactly what incentive could he give, what actual good enough incentive could he give to Vladimir Putin to end this war.
Well, that was the latest from Washington and Moscow. Let's go live to Ukraine and speak to our defence correspondent, Jonathan Beale. And Jonathan, take me through the reaction there's been from Kyiv.
Well, of course, there's no confirmation yet that there will be bilaterals with President Zelensky and President Putin, even trilaterals with President Trump, even though that idea has been floated, and Ukraine is certainly preparing for that. Now, President Zelensky has said he's not afraid to meet President Putin, but we've always known that. He wants a meeting with President Putin to talk about ending the war, and it is President Putin who has resisted that. Now, the indications from the Kremlin at the moment is there are no plans for a trilateral, but it could happen if conditions are met. The question is, what are those conditions? And what we've also from President Zelensky is, first of all, that he thinks Europe should be represented. In other words, friends to back him up in any negotiations. But also he is warning that he and the US must not be deceived by Russia in the detail of these negotiations. So in other words, there's no trust between Russia and Ukraine still, and that is because the war is still ongoing. Russia is still waging its war in the east. It's still conducting its airstrikes right across Ukraine, including here in Dnipro region. Nothing much has changed apart from the hopes of a bilateral conversation between President Putin and President Trump.
Jonathan, exactly as you say, the Kremlin has always dismissed Zelensky being there at the table talking directly to Putin. And I suppose the worry, and you touched upon it in Kyiv, will be there would be then the possibility, the danger of some sort of formula between Trump and Putin that somehow rides roughshod over everything they've been fighting for years now.
Yeah, I think the fundamentals are that there is no change in Russia's conditions for this war, that it wants Ukraine to give up territory, the 4 regions it is attacking. It essentially wants Ukraine to demilitarize. It wants the West to give guarantees that they will not intervene. It wants to ensure that Ukraine will never be a member of NATO, even though NATO says that Ukraine is on an irreversible path to NATO membership. So none of those conditions have changed as far as we know from President Putin, and yet President Trump thinks he's got something to talk about with President Putin, and that is why this meeting is taking place. So none of the conditions of this war have changed. The war itself has not stopped. The attacks have not stopped. So I think there is deep skepticism here as to whether this will lead anything. But of course, President Zelensky needs the support of President Trump. He wants him to impose more sanctions on Russia to make him feel the cost of the war, and therefore he needs to keep on the side of President Trump.
Jonathan Beale, live for us there in Ukraine. Thanks very much. Let's continue with this. Let's speak live to Melinda Herring, who's Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre. Welcome here to BBC News. Your headline thoughts about this meeting?
Great to be with you. So I think that everything sort of revolves around next week. Will it be a meeting between Putin and Trump? And will there be a ceasefire? Or is Trump just going to give him a meeting as a gift? And will Zelensky be involved? So there's a lot of open questions. But I agree with all your correspondents. Moscow hasn't had to give very much in the past day or so.
The other element to this is the possibility that it is classic textbook Putin. You remember back in early May, Starmer, Macron, Merz all went to Kyiv. They threatened a huge package of sanctions if Russia didn't sign up to a ceasefire on the Monday. He then offered up direct talks with Ukraine, and that delayed everything. Here we are 3 months later and not an inch further forward. We could be seeing rinse and repeat of that tactic, couldn't we?
Absolutely, Matthew. And that's the real danger and the real worry. And I think it's important to highlight what's happening to Ukrainians. So the BBC just did a terrific report, and it looked at the number of rocket and drone strikes in the last 6 months. There's been more than 27,000 rockets and drones that have hit Ukraine. And that's almost a threefold increase to what we saw in the last 6 months of Biden's administration. It's not a political point, but you can see that the Russians have really increased the pressure on civilians, and they've managed to double the amount of ballistic rockets that they're making and also increase the drone production in Russia itself. So the pressure is really being felt among civilians in Ukraine.
In terms of the tariffs threat to Russia that is supposed to come in tomorrow, it's odd, isn't it? Because, again, that may or may not happen. We've seen the jump in tariffs to India for buying Russian oil, but not China that buys more of it. It's sort of odd strategy, isn't it?
So go back and look at that executive order. It does open the door for sanctions on others. So the White House feels like it has the ability to push India, but not China, and to leave the threat open. I think that's what the Trump administration, that's their thinking. But the Trump administration has the ability to increase pressure on Russia. It could sanction Russia itself more deeply. It could enforce existing sanctions. There's a number of sanctions on the books that it's not enforcing well. But I think they're opening the door to increasing pressure. And we saw that yesterday when President Trump spoke. He threatened to do more sanctions as well.
A twin final thought then. Why has he not used those obvious levers before? And if this round of direct talks fails, what do you anticipate happens then?
So I think Trump wanted to give Putin a good faith attempt for the first 6 months of his administration. Is it what most people would have done? No. But Trump is a different kind of president, and there is some benefit to that. He has more flexibility than an ideological American president. It hasn't worked, and I think he has seen the light. We know that Melania Trump is telling him constantly about the bombings of civilians. If this round fails, then I think Plan B is Europe, and we see Europe already standing up. Donald Trump did do something quite significant in the last month. He announced that Europe could buy American weapons, and we've seen major commitments from more than 4 different European governments. So I think the burden is going to fall on Europe to continue to supply the weapons to Ukraine.
Melinda Herring, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us on today's Verified Live. Great to talk to you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Next up on the programme, we'll be in the Middle East because a really, really important day with Israel's Security Cabinet about to go into session in the next 45 minutes, an hour, to decide whether to push ahead with that Netanyahu plan for a full occupation of the Gaza Strip. So we'll be live in Jerusalem for the latest on that story here in just a moment or two. But around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. Welcome back to BBC News. Now, as I was saying a moment or two ago, let's turn to that other major story we're covering today, which is likely to develop in the coming hours, because Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is expected to meet with his security cabinet in the next 45 minutes or so to ask them to approve his plan for a full-scale occupation of the Gaza Strip. According to Israeli media, the plan focuses initially on taking full control of Gaza City, relocating its 1 million residents further south. Critics fear an expanded Israeli military operation in Gaza would endanger more Palestinians and the 20 Israeli hostages believed to be still alive and being held captive by Hamas. Meanwhile, the Israel Defense Forces dropped more than 100 aid packages over Gaza yesterday in coordination with 5 other countries. But aid agencies say it is unsafe and the quantity of aid being dropped is totally insufficient. Let's speak first to our Middle East correspondent in Jerusalem, Hugo Bechega. And Hugo, just give me a little of what people are saying in the run-up to this vital meeting of the Security Council.
Yeah, Matthew, so the newspapers in Israel have been dominated by the differences between the political leadership and the military leadership. Earlier this week, there was a very tense exchange between the Prime Minister and the Chief of Staff of the military, who is against the idea of expanding military operations in Gaza and fully occupying the territory. And apparently, he told the Prime Minister that this would be a trap, that this would endanger soldiers and also the lives of the hostages who remain in captivity in Gaza. 20 hostages are believed to be alive, and it is thought that they're being held in those areas where the military hasn't yet entered in Gaza. Gaza City and also the camps in the central part of the Gaza Strip. So this is a very controversial plan by the Prime Minister. It faces opposition from military leaders. So the meeting today of the Security Cabinet is expected to begin in about 45 minutes. And again, recent polls in Israel have suggested consistently that the vast majority of the Israeli public are in favor of a deal with Hamas for the hostages to be freed. And this is very much the position of the families of the hostages, who say that military pressure hasn't really worked, that a negotiated deal is the only way to guarantee the release of the hostages who remain alive. And the vast majority of the public are also in favor of the end of the war.
Hugo, as you were talking, we were looking at the aerial pictures of the colossal amount of destruction on the ground in the Gaza Strip. A simple question, because if this plan is green-lit, what happens to the 2 million civilians?
Yeah, so there is a lot of concern already, and UN officials have called these reports of a possible expansion of Israel's military operation as deeply alarming. There is obviously a lot of concern over the humanitarian situation in Gaza and the possibility that 1 million residents will be again displaced from all those areas that could be the target of the Israeli offensive. But again, I think it's very important to say, because the Prime Minister has been accused by many in this country of prolonging the conflict for political purposes. He is supported by ultranationalist ministers who have been threatening to quit his governing coalition. They have been publicly defending the idea of fully occupying Gaza, expelling Palestinians from Gaza and resettling it with Jews. So we still don't know what full occupation actually means, whether this is a temporary measure or a complete takeover of Gaza. But obviously very serious concerns about what is going to happen with the population there.
Hugo Bechega with the latest. Thanks very much. Let's speak live to Hassan Khatib, who's a professor of international studies at Birzeit University and a former minister in the Palestinian Authority. Welcome here to BBC News. What is your reaction to the plan that we were just hearing about?
Well, first of all, it's not a plan to occupy Gaza, because Gaza is already occupied, or most of it is already occupied. We all know that the Israeli army is controlling the Gaza Strip and controlling also the borders of the Strip, and nobody can get in or out or get anything in or out without the permit of Israel. So this is already an occupation. Probably it's more accurate to say that they want to further complete that occupation or escalate the control of the Israeli army in Gaza. And I think that this is not going to make dramatic changes on the overall scene, except that it is going to make the life of the Gazans more and more miserable. But in terms of finding a solution or getting nearer to achieving the Israeli declared objectives of this war, I don't think this decision is going to make any difference.
I'll come back to those wider points because there are important points in a moment. Yeah. But returning to your central thrust about what this will mean for ordinary Palestinians there in the Gaza Strip, you clearly, when you talk about if it's further escalation, and that's what we're expecting, it to dramatically worsen the situation, the only person that can stop Benjamin Netanyahu going ahead with a move like this appears to be Donald Trump, and he appears to be going along with it. If you had a message to the US president now, what would you say to him?
First of all, I think that Donald Trump is a partner in this Israeli genocide. He is not a different party to this war. He's part of it from the very beginning. And without his unconditional support, Netanyahu wouldn't be able to go that far in terms of the atrocities against Palestinians in Gaza. But the message that we want to convey to the Americans and their president is that the Israeli typical approach of solving any political problem by force, and if force is not working, then the solution is to go for more force. This is a theory that Israel has been trying since the beginning of the Israeli illegal occupation to the Palestinian territories, and it was only instigating more fiercity in the confrontations between Israel as an occupier and the Palestinian people under occupation.
Well, that takes me back to where we were talking about in the first answer, which is, of course, we don't know how long this occupation will actually last for. We will see some of the details perhaps emerge from this security cabinet. But Benjamin Netanyahu has consistently been unable to answer that question, who will run Gaza after the military side of this. What is your answer? Is it the Palestinian Authority? And where do you think we are with any sort of talk about a two-state solution? Because Netanyahu is dead set against it, and President Trump appears to be dead set against it.
In terms of the day after in Gaza, I can tell you that Israel is doomed in terms of being obliged and dragged to permanently occupy and control Gaza, because Israel tried to invite third parties to play a role in running Gaza and failed. And the PA, which is offering the possibility of they have a role in Gaza, that was completely refused continuously by Netanyahu. And we are left with only one of the two players in Gaza, Hamas and Israel. And since Israel is trying to prevent Hamas from controlling Gaza, then their only option is that they will have to continue occupying Gaza and running Gaza for the foreseeable future. They don't have other alternative.
Well, Hassan Khatib, great to talk to you. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Thanks for your time.
Welcome. Thank you.
Now, let's turn to developments here, because the Bank of England has cut interest rates today by 1/4 of a percentage point to 4%, bringing the cost of borrowing to its lowest level for more than 2 years. Its governor, Andrew Bailey, said it had been a finely balanced decision and that any future cuts would need to be made gradually and carefully. The move will reduce monthly mortgage costs for some homeowners, but also means a smaller return for savers. Here's our Deputy Economics Editor, Darshini David.
From prisons to sports pitches, there's no shortage of custom for this steel fence maker in Wolverhampton. But lead design engineer Adam also has to safeguard his own finances. With his 5-year fixed mortgage deal expiring, he faces higher repayments.
It's a bit of a jump. So it's gone up from about £900 to just over £1,000. So yeah, just slightly over 10% increase. But we thought it was going to be more like a £200-300 increase. But luckily we were able to find a good deal.
The issue for Adam and many others is that despite recent cuts, rates remain higher than a few years ago. His boss too is trying to nail things down as the company faces hurdles to its own finances and plans.
For a company of our size with 60 employees, the combined effect was around about £120,000 in the year, which is a big hit for us. Partly because a lot of our competition is foreign based, so we're trying to manufacture in the UK, but we're fighting against companies in Turkey, China, who probably haven't had those sort of increases. So it's a constant battle to become more and more efficient, almost just to stand still.
So the bank faces a dilemma. Its primary job is to get inflation down to the 2% target and keep it there. But it's currently 3.6%. It may remain around that level for some time. On the other hand, it's got to be mindful of the wider economy. And it's particularly being concerned about the jobs market. Unemployment is at a 4-year high of 4.7%. Many businesses are claiming that higher taxes and other policies are having an effect there. And it's those concerns about the wider economy and the longer-term implications for inflation that swung the bank's decision today.
At this meeting, the Monetary Policy Committee judged that a further 0.25 percentage points reduction in bank rate was appropriate. Based on the outlook for inflation, a gradual and careful approach to the further withdrawal of monetary policy restraint remains appropriate.
The bank's decision will give a lift to businesses and some mortgage holders, although it will weigh heavily on savers. And as uncertainty over our prospects continue, it may be a while until we see rates being trimmed again.
That was Darshini David. Next up on the programme, we're talking tariffs. These are live pictures from the port of Philadelphia. Donald Trump's new tariffs kicking in dozens of countries today. He's double tariffs for India. We'll get the latest on the programme from Mumbai and also from New York. That's next. Welcome back to BBC News. Let's turn to our main headlines here. Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are expected to meet for a summit in the next few days to discuss a possible ceasefire in Ukraine. Israel's Security Cabinet is about to meet as Benjamin Netanyahu pushes for a full-scale occupation of the Gaza Strip. Sweeping new tariffs come into effect on goods imported to the US from dozens of countries. We will hear from our correspondent in Mumbai as the US president imposes an extra 25% tariff on India for buying oil from Russia. The first migrants are detained as part of the government's new agreement with France, which means they can be sent back across the English Channel. And the lynx were once one of only 2 native cat species in medieval Britain. We'll speak to a campaigner calling for its reintroduction to parts of the UK. So let's return to one of those headline stories. For the first time, illegal migrants crossing the Channel on small boats have been detained under a new agreement between the UK and France. The migrants have been taken to immigration removal centres with a view to being deported back to France under the so-called one-in, one-out reciprocal agreement with the French authorities. Here's our reporter, Simon Jones.
The crossings have continued, but with a difference. For the first time under the new returns deal, some of those picked up in the Channel by the border force and brought to Dover yesterday are now being held and face being sent back to France. The government won't say how many. It claims that information could be exploited by the smuggling gangs. Critics believe it's because the numbers are very small.
The first migrants who've arrived on the small boats are now in detention. We will then swiftly make the referrals to France, and that process will now start to be able to return people to France. It's the beginning of the pilot, and it will build as well over time. But we're also clear that France is a safe country, so we will robustly defend against any legal challenge that people try, and we do expect for people to start being returned in a matter of weeks.
To try to stop this on the beaches of northern France, as part of the new deal, for every migrant deported, Britain will take an asylum seeker from France believed to have a legitimate claim to come to the UK. But the Shadow Home Secretary, who went out on a boat on the Channel this week to see the situation for himself, says it's a gimmick.
Boatfuls of migrants have crossed the Channel. I saw them leaving French waters, being picked up, and they're arriving behind us in the docks at Dover. So there is no deterrent effect whatsoever. Their deal isn't working.
Footage from the Channel released by the Home Office. It insists the one-in, one-out scheme will take the UK one step closer to restoring order to the immigration system, preventing life-threatening scenes like these. Small boat crossings are at record levels for this point of year. So far, around 25,500 people have reached the UK in dangerously overloaded dinghies. That's an increase of 45% on the same period last year. The UK will have up to 14 days to request the return of individuals arriving by small boat to France. It could take up to 3 months for the process to be completed, according to the treaty signed this week. From today, migrants in France will be able to apply online to come to the UK. The number of people exchanged is initially expected to be limited. The government hopes to ramp up returns over time, but the project will ultimately be judged on whether the crossings do start coming down. Simon Jones, BBC News.
Let's talk tariffs, because Donald Trump's long-threatened tariffs have taken effect on imports from dozens of countries around the world, raising the effective US rate to its highest level in nearly a century. With numerous exemptions and conditions, many governments and businesses remain confused about the final rates that ultimately will be charged. Donald Trump has promised even more tariffs, including a 100% levy on semiconductors imported into the United States, and has doubled tariffs on India for continuing to buy Russian fossil fuels, a move India has called unfair and unjustified. Well, let's speak about that for a little time here on the programme. Let's speak to our correspondent Archana Shukla, who's in Mumbai, and just tell us a little about the reaction there has been from Delhi after these new tariffs were imposed.
Well, the stance here in New Delhi has been a bit more staunch, where New Delhi has held its ground, calling these new additional tariffs as unjustified and unreasonable, defending its purchase of Russian crude, saying it's crucial for India's energy security and to make energy affordable for the 1.4 billion Indians, and also saying that India has been singled out at a time when other countries like European Union or even United States continue to do trade with Russia, and they would be taking all steps possible. We know that the sticking points here are twofold. One in India is definitely the Russian oil imports, but the other is also India's reluctance to open up its agriculture and dairy markets, sticking points on which the earlier trade conversations stalled, and after which the relationship has been strained. So how the negotiations go from here on would be closely watched out for by both businesses and the stock markets. Today in the morning, Prime Minister Modi in a conference indicated, not directly talking about tariffs, but they said that they would do everything to keep the interests of farmers in check and protect the interests of farmers here, somewhere signaling that those could be non-negotiable areas in larger trade talks. But how this progresses is really something that both businesses and the markets are watching.
You talk about continued negotiations, but what are the Indian authorities talking about? Just basic retaliation? Are they holding back on that, or are they openly talking about how they might respond?
That has yet not been made clear by New Delhi. What it appears is they are standing firm on their ground as far as their trade ties with Russia is concerned. Even in the past, India has maintained that this is its sovereign right to have trade ties with countries, with different countries, and from where they purchase, crucial things like energy. And that has been the stance India has. But we've seen over the past couple of weeks, India has toughened its stance in the trade talks with the United States. While earlier they had proactively reduced tariffs on a couple of products, a couple of American products, from motorcycles to whiskies. But over the course, there has been a toughening of stance, and that is what has brought the two countries here. At the same time, even United States is somewhere using this as a leverage. This is a general consensus here from businesses to bureaucrats that possibly United States is using this as a leverage to get a better trade deal, to pressure India on its trade ties, as well as to get a better negotiations on trade. And businesses are quite nervous if that doesn't turn out too, because 50% tariffs put India at the highest taxed bracket. And many businesses that we've been speaking with, some from the textile space or the auto component space who export to the United States, they say that nearly all of their business will go out if this 50% tariff stays in picture. Most of them are seeing their shipments piling up already, because US buyers are now contemplating, should they buy from India, should they buy from Vietnam or Bangladesh, which would turn out cheaper. And that's really putting businesses on hold, and nervousness is building up. There's also some sense that if this continues, it would drag down India's growth by almost 1%, and that is the tricky point which New Delhi will have to find a delicate balance between economy and its strategic trade ties and its ties with the United States.
Very interesting. Thank you very much for that update there from Mumbai. Let's cross to New York, because our North America business correspondent Michelle Fleury waiting to talk to us. And Michelle, so we've got those raft of new tariffs affecting all sorts of different countries. What has the initial impact been on the markets, first of all?
The market reaction has been surprisingly muted. I mean, I guess in some ways investors have got to the point where they're used to Donald Trump sort of laying out very tough tariffs and then later on negotiating whether it's carve-outs or lowering the rates. And so I think they've sort of come to the expectation that, while we're seeing a lot of disruption, they aren't too concerned at the moment.
Just in terms of the impacts, though, I was looking at those figures. You'll have seen them from Ford, the amount they've ended up paying in terms of tariffs, and they make most of the cars in the US. So in terms of the impact on American businesses, take me through it, because Ford, for example, are doing exactly what the president wants and yet incurring all those costs.
Yeah, and it's, you know, Ford, General Motors have all cited big tariff costs and hits to their bottom lines. We've also heard from Toyota today, the Japanese car maker, but remember, it makes a lot of its cars here in the United States as well. It reported perhaps the biggest tariff hit of all the car makers to date. So you're starting to see, we're in the middle of kind of the period when a lot of American companies or companies around the world turn in their results. And you're starting to see the impact of this trade war on them. Now, what's interesting with the car industry is that because it's such a global supply chain, even though the cars are manufactured here, there are so many parts and components that come from around the world that it's virtually impossible for them to escape the tariff hit. And that is the problem. So you've got car makers who are making huge commitments to manufacture, to make vehicles in America. And increasingly, the business models for these firms has become to sort of make the cars where they sell them. So they're doing what President Trump wants, and yet they're still getting hit.
Michelle, let me put pictures onto the screen because we're seeing pictures live from the port of Philadelphia and also LA. What are you seeing in terms of countries perhaps deciding to change where to aim their markets? We had those job figures that Donald Trump so hated only last week. The fear is of a general slowdown in the US economy. Are you seeing any sorts of signs of that already?
Look, I think the jobs market is a very clear indication, and so I think people are going to be looking at that going forward. We get the weekly job claims, and then next week, you know, before the Federal Reserve meets again, we'll get another employment report. What's happening there, what that tells us is that companies, we've talked about this uncertainty, well, now that's starting to translate into hiring decisions or the decision not to take on new people. So you're starting to see that. Then this week we also got a services sector report, and that essentially showed that in that area there's pretty much flatline. So there's concern about the housing market. That also is struggling at the moment. Construction struggling. So you're beginning to see this slowdown. Economists have been talking about this for a while, that the effects would take time to kind of ripple through the economy down to consumers. Remember, a lot of firms brought in a lot of products in anticipation of these tariffs. So there is a delay before essentially the full effects are seen. And I think, you know, it's really October that you're going to have a clearer picture of the full extent of the impact of this on the US economy.
Michelle Fleury, thanks very much. Well, that was the situation from New York. Before that, Mumbai. Let me tell you that the Swiss president has been speaking in the last few minutes, saying that Switzerland is facing an extremely difficult situation because of those 39% tariffs imposed by the United States. Comments from the Swiss president talking about the US being an important trading partner. We want to regulate the relationship with the US, but not at any price. And going on to remind the US president, saying that President Trump thinks the trade deficit is a loss for the US. We don't share that view, and reminding the Americans that they have an agreement to buy F-35 jets, and we are keeping to that, says the Swiss president. If we don't stick with the F-35 deal, then we don't have air defences. But clearly, there is real concern about those 39% tariffs, and they are looking across the range about how they respond to that. So just a few of the latest comments coming there from the Swiss. Let's turn away from that for the next few minutes, because the families of those killed in the Air India crash in Ahmedabad 2 months ago say they've had to endure even more grief after receiving the remains of the wrong victims when they were returned. 260 people were killed seconds after takeoff when both fuel control switches on the Boeing 787 abruptly moved to cut-off settings, causing a total loss of power. Well, Owen Greenlaw's brother, Fingal Greenlaw-Meek, died in the crash along with his husband, Jamie. Owen's been speaking to Newsnight's Katie Razzle about how her family ended up with the wrong remains.
And your mother, she flew to India,
Yes.
she did a DNA test,
Yep.
and she brought back what she thought were Finn's remains.
Yeah. By her own words, she was saying it was chaotic scenes, as you can imagine. And so she went straight to the hospital to give a blood sample. I think it was about 72 hours later we got confirmation.
So she flew to India and she returned with what she thought were her son's remains.
Yes.
which must have been incredibly difficult.
It's the equivalent of losing him twice. So that definitely that's a burden on everyone, really. And Mum had obviously seen the situation there, smelt the smells, seen the sights, heard, seen the crash site. I think for her that made it more real to be able to see that. But obviously to fly home in that kind of solemn situation, really, and I can't imagine what was going through her thoughts doing that. So to come home and realise that's not your son is really tough.
Because that's what happened. You found out that the remains that you were told were his were not.
Yeah. So the first casket that arrived in the UK was tested and found to be the remains of two different people. And based on that, the coroner made the decision to check everything. And so Finn's was checked against DNA that we'd got off headphones at home. We found out that was not Finn. That was not his remains.
Just appalling. And is it right that there is a suggestion that Finn's remains, or some of Finn's remains, have actually been found? That you might be able to be reunited with some of his remains?
So we have been informed that a small piece of tissue, sorry, it's not very pleasant, was taken for DNA testing, and subsequently that piece of Finn has been found, and we have had confirmation this afternoon that that piece has arrived back in the UK and is at the Westminster mortuary awaiting DNA testing.
Well, really difficult testimony from just one of the families involved. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. Welcome back to Verified Live. Now, the UK government has announced plans for a crackdown on risky cosmetic procedures such as non-surgical Brazilian butt lifts, as well as the use of facial fillers and Botox injections by unqualified staff. The proposals also include age restrictions on treatments to protect young people from potentially dangerous beauty trends on social media. Here's Dominic Hughes.
Many providers of non-surgical cosmetic procedures are well-trained, qualified medics, but too many others are not. Ministers describe the industry as a wild west of dodgy practitioners and procedures populated by cosmetic cowboys, causing serious and sometimes catastrophic damage.
We're saying today that we are going to act on this, what is an unregulated and really quite large business. It's grown really rapidly in the last few years. It used to be the preserve of A-list celebrities perhaps, but now it's really popular, largely amongst women, and it's largely a business run by women, lots of small businesses. So we want to support women who want to access these procedures to be safe, and then particularly, as you highlighted, those under 18s.
Ashley has first-hand experience of what happens when things go wrong. A few weeks ago, she told the BBC how she was tempted by what looked like a cheap Brazilian butt lift, but a serious infection developed, resulting in a hospital admission.
On the way home,
the pain just gradually got worse. As the anaesthetic wore off, the pain just got beyond belief. I thought I was going to die in the back of that car.
Now there are proposals to clamp down on rogue operators within the aesthetics industry. So high-risk procedures such as non-surgical Brazilian butt lifts would only be carried out by suitably qualified health professionals. There are also plans to introduce a licensing system for the use of facial and lip fillers and Botox injections, and restrictions on what procedures will be available to under 18s.
These are procedures that really need to be in the hands of additionally qualified healthcare practitioners. And by that, I mean doctors. And actually, in reality, that should really be a plastic surgeon who is fully qualified, knows the anatomy, and can deal with any of the complications that happen.
Complications to procedures can have terrible consequences. Mother of 5, Alice Webb, died after falling unwell, having undergone a non-surgical butt lift. A public consultation in 2023 demonstrated widespread support for tighter regulation among both the public and the legitimate aesthetics industry itself. Ministers say they now need to consult further and then legislate on exactly how this will work in practice. Dominic Hughes, BBC News.
Now, new research has found that lynx could thrive in the UK if released in Northumberland, and 72% of people in that region support their reintroduction. Well, that comes from a year-long consultation run by a number of organisations, including the Wildlife Trusts. Well, Dr. Rob Soman is Director of Landscape Recovery for the Wildlife Trusts. And Doctor, welcome here to the programme. So tell me a little more then about the consultation.
Yeah, it's been a good few years of work, but let me just start with what a lynx is, because they are really a very, very beautiful animal. They're sort of a slim Labrador-sized dog, you know, a cat obviously, but dog-sized. They've got this beautiful golden coat with these lovely black spots and these fantastic tufted ears. Very elusive, very shy, exclusively woodland animals, and importantly, they used to live here. They're kind of now a lost puzzle piece from the jigsaw of life. So we completely got rid of them. We lost our woodlands mainly, and we exterminated them to extinction a few hundreds of years ago. So it'd be amazing if we could get them back. So what we've been doing, so it's Lifescapes, the Wildlife Trust and others, has been looking at ecological studies to see whether it would be possible to get lynx back into England. And we found that really there's only one place in England, which are these remote forests in the northwest of Northumberland, where we think an introduction would be successful. There's enough forest habitat and there's few roads. But the most important thing we've been doing is talking to thousands of people about whether those people that live in that area would be happy to have lynx back in their area. And thankfully, I'm very delighted that 72% of people that actually live in that area would be very keen to have lynx back in the area, not least because these lynx can provide other benefits such as tourism benefits.
Does that include the 72% farmers, say, who will be worried, say, about the lynx eating their sheep?
Yeah, many. So we had a disproportionate number of farmers and land managers and foresters and people in the game industry that that contributed to that survey. So lots of farmers are very supportive of the idea, but equally there's some farmers that have some remaining concerns. So the next thing that we want to do is to work with those people that have some worries, some concerns, and actually look at how would we bring back lynx? What are the things that we can do to minimise risks? There are some risks, and also maximise the opportunities out there.
We're looking at pictures as you're talking. They are incredible looking creatures. Theoretically, how big a population do you think you could actually create here?
Yeah, well, they have very, very low population densities. So we're probably looking at about 50 lynx in the very long term. That could develop a population across sort of northwest Northumberland into Cumbria, into southern Scotland. So it's a very long-term project. Of course, it would take decades to get to that point. But yeah, we think about 50.
A final thought, though, because apart from bringing back a species that has disappeared, what other advantages are there?
Well, one of the main advantages is that, as I say, they're the kind of, if you take species out, if you take a puzzle piece out of the jigsaw piece, what you find is the whole kind of fabric of life starts to disappear. So we know one of the reasons that Britain is so depleted in its wildlife, it's one of the most depleted nations on the globe for its wildlife, is because we've lost some of our big species like lynx. So And one of the reasons that's the case is that in woodlands, what they do is they push the prey around, mainly feed on roe deer, and that would mean you have a bit of undergrazing in some parts of woodland, a bit of overgrazing in other parts. You'd have a much more variability.
Doctor.
That would allow a wildlife explosion, so really good for the forest.
Dr. Sorry to cut across you, but we are out of time in this particular section of our programme. Thanks for joining us. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. We'll have more on that Israeli Security Cabinet that's just underway. We'll bring you that here in a moment or two.